The 1950s and early 60s for horror have been broadly defined by Hammer Films, a film production company from the UK that specialized in releasing gothic horror films that took classic monsters and brought them back to the screen. However, by the middle of the 1960s, the sensibilities of the audiences began to change. As the Hays Code came to an end and Hollywood films became darker and more violent, the Hammer horror aesthetic was no longer as shocking as it once was, and the company began to struggle. Another contributing factor to the downslide of Hammer horror was that in the late 60s, a new branch of horror began to emerge in England and walk the path that Hammer had paved. Unlike its predecessor, which focused on monster films, gothic horror, and the supernatural, fantastical elements of horror, this new wave of horror was a lot more grounded and stripped down. And although at first it seemed that these new films didn't have a lot in common with one another, soon people began to notice various thematic similarities that occurred in all of them. Secluded village communities that harbor dark secrets, ancient artifacts being dug up in the land, the woods and rural uncivilized areas, and the old religion coming back to life. And all of this culminated in a pivotal point when in 1970, a reviewer by the name of Rod Cooper wrote a piece about Blood on Satan's Claw in the largest British film journal at the time. And in it he referred to the film with the term folk horror for the very first time.
He brought me out the same way, to reverence the music and the drama and the rituals of the old gods, to love nature and to fear it, and to rely on it and to appease it where necessary. He brought me out...
He brought you up to be a pagan!
A heathen, conceivably, but not, I hope, an unenlightened one.
None of these films were made in response to Hammer horror, but it's easy to see how they mark a shift in audiences' sensibilities. From the fantastical to the more grounded and realistic. A big part of what defined this folk horror aesthetic and themes were the low-budget or made-for-TV films from the 60s such as Redbreast or Whistle and I'll Come to You. It's entirely possible that their narrative structure was greatly informed by the budget restraints, which resulted in a more minimal narrative that dealt more with psychological fears like paranoia and the unknown. But a lot of these aspects of the films carried over to the bigger productions as well. The Wicker Man is probably the most famous British folk horror film, but the narrative is almost identical to the one in Redbreast. The film is about a person who leaves the modern world behind and stumbles into a secluded community, which ends up being not as normal as it initially appeared.
It's the old religion. I read about it in a book. They used to bury them under big stones. They thought they were witches.
I never heard that.
I read about it in a book.
But more than even a shift in sensibilities, the emergence of folk horror is a cultural benchmark. These ideas and fears aren't just rooted in budget restraints or a particular narrative structure, they reflect the fears of the society that conceived them. The most common trope in North American folk horror, for instance, is the Native American burial ground, a physical reminder of the crimes that the current inhabitants have committed against the Native Americans, and a threat of retribution to those who benefit from these crimes to this day. Eastern European folk horror, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more atmospheric and deals with exclusively fairy tales and folklore itself, because they come from a place and time when cultural genocide was the dominant fear amongst the people. Calling upon the country's national folklore was one of the only ways to combat it. The recurrent trope in British folk horror is that same Redbreast and Wicker Man narrative. The modern man or woman stepping outside of known geography and finding themselves in a clash with the rural world. In Whistle and I'll Come to You, it's an educated modern man who finds a whistle in the dunes and is driven mad, reduced to sucking on his own thumb like a baby. In Stigma, it's a modern woman who uncovers an ancient curse when she disturbs a menhir in her family's backyard. In A Warning to the Curious, it's a modern man who in his search for ancient treasure in the woods instead uncovers a curse. In The Wicker Man, another modern man investigates an isolated island community, which turns out to be a cult that sacrifices him. All these films detail an excursion deep into the land where the modern people who dared venture there find a lot more than they bargained for.
It's not right, Nora, vegetating in the country like this. She should be back in town, getting on with the business of living. I wanted to go off this place, and the sooner the better. Sell it. Or if she doesn't want to do that, keep it for weekends and ask people to stay.
The reason why these people meet their demise out in the land is the same reason why woods are scary at night, the unknown. In modern and industrialized 1960s and 70s Britain, where the majority of the population lived in big cities, the lands they once resided over were left behind, left in the dark. A return to these lands isn't just a visit to the past, it's actively asking the question of what happened to them. And it's a fear of what you might find out when you ask this question. finding out that the old way of life, the old religion, isn't truly dead, that it's still alive and there are still people who follow it, people who don't uphold modern values and ideals. And ultimately it's also a fear of finding something that contradicts your own beliefs. The fear that out there in the land there really is an enchantment that could punish you for stepping outside the safety of the city walls. A fear that the woods at night really are alive.